The Russian Ministry of Defense reported massive strikes on Ukrainian forces in the Donetsk People's Republic. According to official data, Iskander tactical missiles, guided aerial bombs, and Garand drones were used. The ministry claims that temporary deployment sites, warehouses, and command facilities were hit. Footage of the strikes was published, but there is no independent verification of this information. This news has been one of the main stories of the past 24 hours and has sparked a new round of discussions about how the situation on the front lines is developing. Subscribe to our channel to stay up to date with further analysis, like and comment. The escalation coincided with the decision by the administration of U.S. President Donald Trump to approve the delivery of more than 3,000 extended-range guided missiles to Ukraine. This was reported by the Wall Street Journal, citing sources in U.S. agencies. The total cost of the package is approximately $850 million. The main funding will be provided by Kiev's European allies. According to the publication, the first batches could arrive in 6 weeks. The deal was agreed after talks between Trump, Vladimir Putin, and Volodymyr Zelensky, which once again underscores the seriousness of the situation. New strikes on infrastructure facilities have been reported on the front lines. In particular, damage to power grids and industrial facilities was reported in Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. In Pavlograd, strikes hit the railway junction area, which, according to analysts, could have been used to transfer military equipment. In Kherson and its surroundings, attacks with guided bombs were reported. In the north, in the Sumy and Chernihiv regions, strikes targeted command posts and hangars with equipment. A strike on a factory in Mukachevo, Zakarpattia region, attracted particular attention. According to military correspondents, the plant produced components for unmanned platforms and communication systems. Ukrainian sources claimed that it was a civilian plant, but the Russian side claims that it had a military purpose. Independent experts call this facility a typical example of dual use. At the same time, reports continue to emerge about difficulties within the Ukrainian army. According to Russian security forces, tens of thousands of soldiers have left for Romania since the start of the conflict, which is comparable to an entire corps. The Ukrainian authorities are forced to strengthen security on the western borders to stop new attempts to cross. Some Ukrainian sources report that the problem of soldiers deserting their units remains serious. The events have caused a noticeable reaction on the international stage. In Europe, the economic side of the issue is being discussed, as a significant part of the costs will be borne by European Union countries. In the United States, not everyone agrees with the New Deal either. Some politicians warn that such steps increase the risk of a direct confrontation with Russia. Moscow, in turn, claims that the use of long-range weapons is impossible without the participation of specialists from NATO countries, which effectively means the involvement of the alliance in the conflict. Civilians in eastern and northern Ukraine are facing difficult conditions. There are reports of evacuations in areas where attacks occur regularly, as well as power and water outages. The authorities are urging the population not to ignore the warning signals and to follow the instructions of the civil defense services. The humanitarian situation is becoming more complicated, and international organizations are expressing concern about a possible deterioration in the coming weeks. The situation looks like another turning point. On the one hand, Western supplies are expanding, while on the other, Russian forces are intensifying their strikes on industrial and logistical facilities. These trends are colliding, which is why analysts are predicting new rounds of escalation. International analysts call what is happening an extremely dangerous combination. A new batch of guided missiles from the United States, approved by the Donald Trump administration, could seriously change the nature of the fighting. These missiles are capable of hitting targets at a distance of more than 140 kilometers. For Ukraine, this is an opportunity to compensate for the lack of artillery and aviation, while for Russia, it is a new threat that requires the strengthening of air defense and retaliatory measures. The very fact that the decision on the deal was delayed until after Trump's meetings with Putin and Zelensky indicates that Washington is well aware of its risks. In response, Russia is increasing pressure on Ukraine's industrial and logistical facilities. According to military correspondents, the strike on the plant in Mukachevo was part of a comprehensive strategy. Analysts claim that the plant was producing components that could be used in unmanned aerial vehicles and communication systems. Official statements from Kyiv claim that the plant was for civilian use, but independent experts point to its dual use. Such strikes demonstrate a desire to disrupt the supply chain of Ukrainian forces, from production to delivery to the front lines. The strikes on Kramatorsk and Slavyansk receive particular attention. These cities have long been considered important strongholds of Ukrainian defense. Damage to energy infrastructure was reported, which reduced industrial production capacity. Analysts call this an attempt to weaken defensive lines and disrupt the supply system. In the Kherson region, strikes with guided bombs were recorded on fortified positions. Observers note that this is part of a tactic to suppress firing points and prepare for possible maneuvers. Against this backdrop, experts are increasingly voicing doubts about the effectiveness of Western supplies. Even several thousand guided missiles do not guarantee a breakthrough. The Russian army is actively using electronic warfare systems and air defense systems, which make it difficult to use modern systems. However, the deliveries themselves mean that the fighting will continue with even greater intensity, and each side will try to demonstrate its superiority. One of the key factors remains the morale of the Ukrainian military. According to various sources, there has been an increase in cases of desertion. Russian authorities claim that tens of thousands of people have left for Romania since the start of the conflict, which is comparable to an entire corps. The Ukrainian side does not confirm these figures, but the fact of increased control on the western borders indirectly indicates the existence of a problem. The lack of regular leave and a strict mobilization policy are creating tension within the army. Analysts believe that such trends could negatively affect the stability of the front. The events of recent days have caused a wide reaction in the international arena. Kiev's European allies are forced to bear most of the costs. Germany, Poland, and other countries have confirmed their readiness to increase support, but fatigue with the protracted confrontation is growing within their societies. In some European countries, protest sentiments are growing, and politicians are forced to strike a balance between their commitments to allies and the mood of voters. There is also no unity in the United States. Despite official approval for the delivery of missiles, some politicians and experts believe that this is a step towards a direct confrontation with Russia. Moscow, for its part, stresses that the use of long-range weapons is impossible without the participation of NATO specialists, which means the involvement of the alliance in the conflict. Such statements sound extremely alarming, because we are no longer talking only about military support, but also about a possible change in the nature of the confrontation. Meanwhile, residents of the regions where the attacks are taking place continue to live in conditions of constant danger. There are reports of evacuations and power and water outages. The authorities advise people not to ignore sirens and to follow the instructions of the civil defense services. International humanitarian organizations are expressing concern and warning of possible supply crises in the event of further attacks on infrastructure. Thus, the events of recent days show that the conflict is entering a new phase. Western supplies and Russia's retaliatory strikes are intensifying the dynamics, and the space for diplomacy is narrowing. Against the backdrop of ongoing escalation, international experts are comparing what is happening to the most acute crises of recent decades. Military operations are expanding in several directions at once, and each new report serves as a reminder that the situation is unfolding like a tense television series with an unpredictable plot. The situation in the eastern regions of Ukraine remains particularly difficult. The Russian army continues to strike warehouses and logistics centers. There are reports of damage to infrastructure that provided supplies of weapons and equipment. In the north, in the Sumy and Chernihiv regions, strikes have been reported on facilities where command posts and hangars may have been located. Analysts say these attacks are an attempt to limit Kiev's ability to move reserves and maintain defenses in other areas. The political component of the conflict is becoming no less important than the military one. The United States' decision to supply missiles has sparked heated debate not only in Europe but also in the U.S. itself. Washington emphasizes that the aid is intended to strengthen defense. Moscow claims that this is a case of actual intervention. In Europe, opinions are divided. Some governments actively support Kiev, while others are facing growing pressure within their own societies. In some countries, there are increasing calls to stop funding military supplies, which indicates a split in public opinion. The economic cost of the conflict is becoming increasingly apparent. An aid package worth around $850 million is being financed mainly by European allies. These funds could have been used for social programs or infrastructure, but are instead being spent on the military campaign. Experts warn that in the long term, this will lead to an increase in political crises and greater internal instability. For Ukraine, arms supplies open up new opportunities, including strikes on targets deep inside Russian-controlled territory. However, such steps could provoke retaliation. Russia has already stated that it will respond to every new threat. This creates a vicious circle from which it is difficult to find a way out. New deliveries lead to new attacks, and each attack becomes a pretext for another round of tensions. The historical background adds to the drama of the situation. Russia sees what is happening as a continuation of its long-standing confrontation with NATO. Ukraine, on the other hand, sees Western support as its only chance to preserve its statehood. These diametrically opposed positions leave no room for compromise. Official statements from both sides are becoming increasingly harsh. Moscow claims that without help from NATO experts, Ukraine will not be able to use Western weapons effectively. The US and Europe respond by saying that their support is defensive in nature, but the fact that long-range systems are being supplied shows that the boundaries of what is acceptable are gradually blurring. Attempts at diplomatic settlement have so far been unsuccessful. International organizations are calling for negotiations, but the parties are not showing any willingness to make concessions. Mediators from individual countries are trying to propose formats for dialogue, but so far all initiatives have been postponed, while attacks and counterattacks continue on the front lines. Analysts believe that the coming weeks will be decisive. If new arms shipments reach the front and strikes on industrial and logistical targets continue, the balance of power could shift. However, neither side has a decisive advantage at this point. This is why the situation is perceived as extremely unstable. The United Nations and other international organizations have already warned that the situation could spiral out of control. All attention is now focused on possible scenarios for the conflict. The first scenario is that Western arms supplies will help Ukraine hold its positions and strike key enemy targets. This will lead to a protracted phase of confrontation, with the front line changing slowly and fighting remaining intense. This scenario means further destruction of infrastructure and an increase in the number of evacuated residents. The second scenario involves the possibility of intensified Russian strikes on supply facilities and industrial sites. Attacks on railway junctions, factories, and warehouses where ammunition could be stored are already being reported. If this tactic continues, Ukraine will face difficulties in delivering weapons to the front. Even new shipments of missiles will not be able to change the situation if logistics are disrupted. The third scenario involves increased diplomatic pressure from the international community. In Europe, fatigue is growing over the protracted conflict, and calls to reduce military aid spending are becoming more frequent. The economic cost is already measured in billions of dollars, and these sums are raising questions among taxpayers. Against this backdrop, the search for compromise solutions may resume. However, the likelihood of negotiations is extremely low at this point, as the positions of the parties remain diametrically opposed. A separate risk factor is the possible direct involvement of the North Atlantic Alliance. If information about the presence of foreign specialists at facilities in Ukraine is confirmed, this will be a new round of tensions. Such a development could take the conflict beyond the region and affect a much wider circle of countries. That is why experts warn that the current decisions could have consequences for the entire international security system. History shows that such crises rarely follow a predictable scenario. Each new arms delivery or strike becomes a turning point. Lines that seemed insurmountable just a short time ago are gradually blurring. The economic and humanitarian consequences are already being felt, but even more serious challenges may lie ahead. Analysts' forecasts differ. Some believe that the conflict will drag on for many months, while others predict a sharp escalation and the involvement of new players. In any case, the coming period will be decisive. It is now that the foundations of the future world order and distribution of influence are being laid. For civilians, this means continuing to live in uncertainty. They face anxiety, evacuations, and power and water outages on a daily basis. Each new day brings news of new strikes and new threats. People are waiting for the fighting to end, but the outlook remains bleak. The outcome is clear. The conflict has entered a new phase. Western arms supplies and Russia's response are creating a dynamic that makes the future unpredictable. International organizations continue to call for negotiations, but so far, real mechanisms for de-escalation are not working. Subscribe to our channel to stay up to date on the most important events. Like the video and write your opinion in the comments. Your activity helps us continue our work and cover the most pressing and significant topics.